All right. So let's just get going. I hope everyone enjoyed their week off from this class. I mean, I'm sure you had other things and other classes and all. Is everyone doing all right? No, nothing too bad. At least we're not in Texas.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of work, definitely.
Yeah, and of course, if you're anything like me, work is a lot harder to get done if you're locked away and you don't see other human beings most of the time. So glad to hear some of you are hanging in there. Glad to hear you're getting some stuff done. All right, so today's topic, we are going to, I said that this course was in CyberEthics, and we started off with just pure ethics to the last class. This class, we're going to move into the cyber ethics-y part. We're going to be looking at all the technology side of it. But we're going to start off with not the most interesting topic in this class. Nonetheless, it is a very important topic and one to really consider. And so the topic today is professional ethics. And what that means we're going to be talking about is just what is professional ethics? And then two major questions that, well, I guess three major topics within the overall arc of professional ethics. So the first question then is, what is professional ethics? So you can either give me examples of, so professional ethics obviously is going to be ethics tied to professions or professionals. So what is the definition of a profession, or what are some examples of professions? When somebody says they're a professional, what do they mean?
It's usually something related to their job, like being a lawyer. It's changed mostly over the years. Now it includes like a bunch of stuff, like computer scientist, analysis or something, or like professions. And then there's also like the subcategories like of it.
Software programmer. Very good example. So it's tied in with job. So that's the first thing. And some examples we have are lawyers, computer science professionals, including software programmers. Anyone else want to give some other examples while we're here?
Yeah, a classic one, I think, is a doctor. It's
yeah,
always
doctor's another.
Mhm.
Any others people want to go with? A person, so a professional, Cynthia says, a person who gets paid for a living to do something. So this is getting paid. And however, there's one thing that I want to stress here. Is every single job a professional, as we use the term? In some sense, if you're using it loosely, you might say yes, but technically not everyone who has a job is a professional.
Oh no, any criminal activity really, or like illegal activity is basically not really considered a profession.
I think that you're onto something there, but I also think you could probably make an argument that certain criminal enterprises are professionals. So like, I think
a hacker could be a professional one.
Pardon?
A hacker can be a professional one.
Yeah, so
in their minds, they're professionals.
Oh yeah.
A hacker who uses their hacking to exclusively take money from other people, and not only that, but can get hired by other people to hack into systems, like the stereotypical hacker in a like Hollywood action movie. Ibrahima?
I don't know. I think a professional is a person that has a certain talent and is able to do stuff that other people are not able to do.
Yeah, so we have this somebody with a talent, and also that Anwar says a trained and skilled individual. And this is really what the key is with professions versus other jobs. It's not just a job and that you're paid, it's that you have a skill and you have training and you have expertise. So, for instance,
Professor, I have this question. What about like voluntary job? You don't get paid, but you might have the skills and it.
So I think in that case, you'd want to say that, well, it depends on how you're doing it. If you are doing it in the sort of way where it's just on the side and you never get paid, it's going to be a little bit less tempting to say you're a professional. But if it's something where you get paid sometimes, but other times you do it for free, you'd be more tempted, I think, to say you are a professional in that field. So if like a lawyer like your best friend's a lawyer and they agree to help you out for free, they're still a professional because most of the time they're getting paid for it and they have a lot of training and expertise. So I think it's going to depend on a case-by-case basis. But it's a very good question. So yeah, this is why, going back to Marcus's point, I can imagine somebody who's like a super skilled forger, like somebody who fakes signatures, if they have a lot of training and expertise in it, even though forging signatures is illegal, you could argue that they're a professional forger or a professional counterfeiter, even though those things are illegal. So that's why I want to say that sometimes the reason that we're tempted not to say it's a profession is because very rarely do we think of these sorts of things as things that you go through a lot of schooling or a lot of training. Like there's not there's medical school, there's law school, there's computer science degrees, but we don't really think of like thief school or torturer school or something like that. So this is really the big idea with professions. There are these jobs, they're paid, it requires a lot of skill. You can't just become a professional in something. You need to train in it for many years. So like, for instance, like your first job was almost certainly not a job that you would say was a profession. So mine was cleaning pools. It sucked, but it was not a profession. It doesn't take that, it took me about a day to do the training, which basically just meant like, if there's a dead animal floating in this pool, take it out with this large net. That was the extent of my training. So if, however, I were somebody who designed pools and had to think about the quality of the soil and how to make the inside of the pool and how to shape it, then I would become a professional landscaper. So that's what we're talking about here. And just about anything that involves expertise can be a professional. It can be an athlete. That's why we talk about professional athletes, people who spend years and years perfecting their craft and get paid to do it. You can talk about
Professor.
Yeah.
Could artists also be considered like a professional if you are like a poet or?
Yeah, absolutely. If you, I think artists can definitely, especially an artist who has gone through a lot of training. So for instance, if you get a degree in an English department or you go to a creative writing program and then it's your main source of income, yeah, you could definitely say it's professional. And especially if you're then capable of teaching those skills to someone else. So really just about anything can be construed as a professional. Now, that's the profession part of it. What about the ethics part? What is professional ethics? So what would be a definition here? If this is what we've said professions are, and a couple classes ago we said what ethics was, what is professional ethics? We'll just stick them together. So what is professional ethics, Jorge?
Professor, yeah, go ahead. You can go.
Oh, no, I was just about to say that I think like, I don't know, when you make an agreement with a company, right, and you sign to keep some information of the company, you should respect that acceptable agreement. I don't know. That's what I have in mind.
That would be a really good example of an ethical question of professional setting. So that's definitely something that falls under this heading. Emery says the standards of behavior expected by professionals. So that's another thing that's definitely on the mark. It is these questions around what you should do if you're a professional. Jorge, what did you want to say?
It was just like a side note, and this ethics like vary according to the profession. Like, it'll be like a different sets of rules or ethics for depending on the profession.
Yeah, so that's exact. So if we combine those three answers you just gave together, we get the definition of professional ethics. So what professional ethics is the study or the set of guidelines that control the behaviors of professionals in a certain field. And the reason why it's so important to have these ethical things is that the sorts of questions you face and the sorts of answers you have to give change from field to field. So what is professional ethics? Set of moral principles that govern behavior in a certain profession. That says profession. So yeah, and what Jorge just brought up is this key point of that the professional or the standard moral principles are different for different professions. And also this ties in with why we have professional ethics in particular. So for instance, we talked about last time just ethics in general, doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing. So the question is, why can't we just apply that sort of general sort of ethical theorizing to the case of professionals in a certain area of expertise? What is it about professions that mean that we need specialized ethics that differ from field to field? What is it that makes that the case?
Wait, can you say that one more time? Because I didn't.
So yeah, so 2 times ago, or I guess 2 weeks ago, last time, we talked about ethics in general, just like what is it to do the right thing? What is it to do the wrong thing? How do we decide what to do? So you might think just in your everyday life, well, if you take ethics in general, you can just apply it to every single thing you encounter. You don't need specialized ethics. You just learn how to do the right thing in a trolley problem, and then you go and apply it in your computer science degree, or if you decide to become a doctor. However, Jorge said that if you actually look at it, different fields have different ethical principles. They have different ethics that are tied to that profession. Why would that be the case? Why would we have specialized ethics? Why would we have specialized ethics for each profession instead of just a general umbrella that covers everything?
Because that wouldn't really apply to, like, depending on the field, of course, like there has to be certain stuff like that pertains to that specific field.
So that's exactly. It varies based on the profession, and because of, remember what we were saying in terms of the expertise tied in, because professions are very, you need a lot of training to get into the profession. One of the things is the questions you face in that profession are not going to be the types of things that are going to be faced by people outside that profession. Jorge.
Yeah, Professor, I was going to say, thinking about the doctor, he has to be very careful because he's dealing with someone else's life, as opposed to a lawyer.
That's the second thing. So one is it's the demands of a job differ. And then 2, the stakes are very, very high. So for instance, let's just imagine a lot of people's first jobs are at a restaurant. And at that restaurant, your first job is going to be that very often your first job is a busboy or a dishwasher. If you're a busboy or a bus girl or bus individual, and your job is just to take away plates, what can go wrong if you make a mistake?
You could break dishes, or
you might break some dishes and you might spill some food. And despite the fact, if you're a waiter, you might write down the wrong order. And despite the fact that there are many people out there who seem to think that if you're given the wrong food order, it's literally the end of the world. The fact is, it's not. If you're working in a restaurant and something goes wrong in one order, it's not the end of the world. If you're a doctor and you make a mistake, what happens? If you're a surgeon, what happens?
The person can die.
Yeah, one little mistake, somebody can die. If you're a lawyer and you make a mistake, what can happen?
The person can go to jail for life or something like that?
Yeah, somebody can go to jail who doesn't belong there, or somebody cannot go to jail even though they've committed a crime. These stakes are much, much higher. So this is another reason that we spend time focusing on professional ethics. So as Cynthia says, if you think about these more specific questions, you have more practice. So if you've thought about like, oh, you know what, in an, excuse me, in a general case, I know the trolley problem, so therefore I'm ready for a doctor case. But then you go and look at it, and it seems like if you've actually thought about what is the right thing to do in a particular type of surgery if something goes wrong, then you'll be much quicker and able to make these decisions in a quicker amount of time, which is another aspect of professions. Is very often you need to make quick decisions that have big consequences. And because of this, it helps to have thought about these issues over a long period of time. Now, there's another question as well, or another issue as well, about why we need specialized ethics. So if I am walking down the street and I punch an old lady in the face, have I done something wrong?
Of course.
Yes, of course I have. And if you saw me do this, would you know immediately that I've done something wrong?
Yep.
Yeah, you'd know. It's obvious. You watch me punch someone in the face. Now, if a doctor decides to save some money, and instead of giving somebody, what they actually decide to do is they have the COVID vaccine. They have the COVID vaccine and they know they're supposed to give people 2 shots, but they've discovered that there's an illegal black market for the COVID vaccine. So what they'll do is give people, instead of giving them the 2 shots, they give them 1 shot and then they take the other one and sell it on the black market. In this sort of case, would you, somebody watching the behavior of this doctor, be able to tell whether or not, like if you saw or read that they had done this, you'd be able to know that they had done it. But if you were just watching in a doctor's office and you just watch them giving people shots, would you be able to tell whether they were giving someone the actual COVID vaccine or just some water?
No.
No.
No. Who would be able to tell that?
A doctor, somebody that is in the same profession as the person.
Exactly. That's the final point. It's not just that the demands are different and the stakes are different. The issue is 3, only another professional can evaluate the action. So in a case with like if a doctor cuts a corner while doing surgery, and I could stand there in the surgery room watching a doctor do surgery, and I could not tell whether this doctor was making mistakes because they were not paying attention or whether they were doing it perfectly fine. But if there was another doctor there in my place, they would immediately know that this doctor's not doing it right. In the same way where if you are a lawyer and you watch somebody, like I can't tell watching in a courtroom whether a lawyer is properly prepared for a case, but another lawyer would very quickly be able to tell whether corners were being cut. So the idea is that the only person who's able to tell whether a professional is doing something immoral, because the actions that define the profession are so technical, is another professional. So that's another reason why we need professional ethics. We need these principles that govern the particular ethical behaviors of people in a profession, because an ordinary person is not going to be able to assess whether this person is doing the right thing. And not only that, it's not just that an ordinary person isn't going to be able to tell, but on top of that, if something goes wrong, the stakes are really, really high. So, if the surgeon cuts a corner, you can end up with, every once in a while you hear these cases in which the surgeon had the X-ray upside down when they were looking at it and accidentally removes the wrong lung from somebody's body. So, they've got cancer on this side, and instead, because the X-ray was upside down, the doctor took out this side. Another doctor looking over that doctor's shoulder would probably be able to tell, like, you have the X-ray backwards. I couldn't make that decision. I couldn't tell. So another doctor would know that is a very easy mistake. This person needs to lose their medical license. So does all this make sense about why professional ethics is a thing? Okay, so here's the last question. How do you do professional ethics? Or more importantly, what things are put in place to make sure that people in a certain profession behave well? So what is it that ensures that doctors are not breaking the rules and make sure lawyers are doing the things that they need to do? There are generally a few systems in place that allow for this. Anyone know what some of these are?
Contracts.
Say that again?
It's like contracts or like something enforced by like a company, yeah.
So that's the first thing, is very often there's an oversight body. So if I decide to go onto WebMD and spend a lot of time just Google searching how to do surgery, and I feel very confident that I know how to do surgery, if I decide, like, I open my home and I put like a sign out front that says, "Doctor here, do you want lung surgery?" I can do it. I'm legally not allowed in the United States. In the United States, there is a governing body of medical professionals who decide who is worthy of being a doctor and who is not. And if you attempt to do surgery without the proper licensing from this oversight body, as Andrew says, you can get punished. So there's also a punishment element. there are laws that govern whether or not you're allowed to do it. So if you practice law without actually getting the proper approval from the, I can never remember what the lawyer organization is, you can go to jail for doing that. Also, if you try to do surgery without the proper licensing, you can go to jail. So, Bar Association, thank you. Yeah, the Bar Association. So, the Bar Association's for lawyers, the Medical Association, again, I never remember the names. I think it's the something of Medical Doctors of America, yada, yada. Anyway, it's all the doctors get together and say what you are and aren't allowed to do. And so there's an oversight body that's put in place, and who is in that oversight body? What sort of people make up the group of people who judge doctors?
A group of doctors, right?
Yeah, another group of doctors, professionals themselves. So the oversight body is going to be made up of people in that profession. And then they get to decide whether you're able to do it or not. And very often, and especially in the case of lawyers and doctors, what you have to do to be allowed to practice law or be allowed to practice medicine. It's not what do you have to do to prove to this oversight body that you're worthy. So you go to medical school.
I guess meet the requirements and, you know,
And just like with getting into college, what is there at the end? You go to medical school, you get all your training.
You take an oath?
You take an oath, so that's part of it as well. There's an oath in here. And so that's another really good one, is once you've gotten everything, you also have to promise to do it. And perform a task with that training is one of the things, but there's also just a straight up what? What is your least favorite thing to have to do? Usually happens, yeah, an exam. Anwar, there's a test. There's a bar exam if you're a lawyer. There's a board certification test if you're a doctor. So even if you do perfectly in law school, you go to the best possible law school, if you don't pass this test at the end, you do not get to practice law. And with doctors, you have to retake a new version of the test every few years. And if you fail, you aren't allowed to be a doctor until you pass the test again. So there's also tests. And there are these oaths which govern your behavior. So it's not just that you have the regular sorts of like, don't do the wrong thing. There are also oaths you have to take when you're working in that field. And these oaths are things where there are extra rules that get put in place by the governing body or by the oversight body that tells you if you break this oath, you can also lose your job. So for instance, with doctors, if you're a doctor, so imagine it's an alternate reality where somehow Hitler's still alive and you know Hitler's a very bad guy. Imagine Hitler comes in, you're a surgeon, Hitler comes in with a bullet wound in his chest. What, as a doctor, do you have to, by law, do with Hitler?
You need to save his life.
You have to save Hitler's life. Yes, legally, if you decide, you know what, this is a very bad guy, I don't want to save his life, you will lose your job as a doctor. So there are special, and there's this thing, the Hippocratic Oath, which says I must provide the best possible care to whoever is in my doctor's office, regardless of my personal feelings about this person or what they do. So that's another thing. So this is the way that these professional organizations or these professions ensure that people in those professions are behaving well. There are oversight bodies comprised of other people in that profession. There are punishments for those who break the rules. They can go to, and those punishments aren't just like a slap on the wrist. Those are full on legal issues. There are oaths you have to take. So it's not just like, yeah, I promise to work hard. It's like, I agree to these extra rules to make sure that I'm being a good person. And I have taken tests to prove that I'm qualified to do this. And even things like plumbing, which isn't quite like a doctor in terms of the number of years of training, you still have to become, you have to take these tests to prove you know what you're doing. Because, you know, as we see, those of you who saw the any of the news stories coming out of Texas this week, when plumbing breaks, there are big problems. So any sort of thing with a profession, there are these tests that you have to take. So that's really the general view of professional ethics. There are these highly trained, and usually because the training is high, there's high pay with them, jobs that you need to have a certain level of training so you can take on the problems of that job and understand them. And because of that, specialty, high stakes ethical questions come up. So everyone on board with this general stuff about professional ethics?
Yes, Professor.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, all right, so let me erase all this. Why are we talking about professional ethics in this class as our first part of cyber ethics? I think Marcus kind of brought it up already. What reason, or kind of touched on the reason that we'd be talking about those general ideas in this class?
Because we also, as a cybersecurity experts, we're going to have some ethics that we're supposed to have.
Yeah, here's the simple answer is that IT, information technology / cyber, is a profession, or more accurately, a lot of professions. So, for instance, let's talk about cybersecurity. That's a really good one. If your firewall doesn't work, who's going to be able to tell you that you've got a crappy firewall or you've got a major flaw in your company's security system?
You're supposed to be able to solve yourself that? I mean, you actually doing the job, no?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you for a second there, Yaris.
Oh no, I was just saying, like, if you have that type of problem, like, you shouldn't be able to tell yourself. I mean, you're the one that's on the job. If not, admin should be able to do that.
An admin or Jorge?
No, I just wanted to add professional in this case.
Exactly. The only person who's going to know how to do this is somebody who knows how to code, and more importantly, somebody who knows how to make firewalls. You can show me a hole in a physical wall and I'd be able to tell, like, yes, you have a hole in your wall. You can show me the best possible, like, show me the code for the best security system in the world and show me the code that runs, I don't know, Candy Crush, and I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. You could install Candy Crush and just be like, here, this is your new firewall. I would have no clue. Why? Because I'm not a professional in this field. So the reason we're bringing this up with ethical issues with computer technology is that the very same sorts of professional ethical questions that apply in cases like doctors and lawyers apply in IT. To be able, like, just think about what happens when your grandmother's email goes wrong. Like, or how many of you have had the pleasure of Zoom or Skype or FaceTiming with your grandparents during COVID? Has anyone other than me had the delight of this, like, high comedy?
No, I've done it. I have to help them through it.
Yeah, I'd say I spent 4 minutes talking to my grandmother and 4 hours getting her set up to try to talk to me. Why? She doesn't know computers. And if you have that level of lack of computer technology, or knowledge of computer technology, you're sure as hell not going to know whether your computer system is safe, whether you're literally giving away all of your information. The only person who's going to be able to tell whether a certain security system for a company is safe is a professional in that field. And because of this, you're going to have specialized ethical questions that come up that only another professional can answer. And also, like with other cases, so we said, what happens if a doctor makes a mistake? Somebody can die. What happens if an IT professional or a coder makes a mistake? To answer this question, no, go ahead.
No, I just had an idea and I totally forgot about it.
That's all right. So here's the question: is if a doctor makes a mistake, it can go wrong because what a doctor's doing is working on a human body. Now, the question, so in the same way, you could ask yourself, what could go wrong if an IT professional makes a mistake? Well, the question becomes, what is that IT professional working on? So think of some of the things they might be working on and what can go wrong. Name some things that are run by computers these days.
The company can lose the money or the...
So here's one thing. Company can lose a ton of money if you make a mistake. So for instance, video games are a really clear case of this sort of thing, just because it's a clear case in which we have computer programmers working for a company and the products produced by those programmers end up affecting the quality of that company. So for instance, what happens when a video game comes out? Like a movie, there are a lot of reviews. People look at those reviews and decide whether or not to buy the game based on those reviews. if that company had a ton of bugs in their game when it comes out, very often few people buy the game. So if the game is like, you spend 10 years making a game and it costs you 20 million and then nobody buys it because the programmers were making mistakes, then you're going to have a problem for that company. Amory says identity theft. So identity theft. So what is the issue with identity theft here? Well, how is our identity generally protected? What sorts of things are in place that allow us? Because I mean, you're all using your credit cards online all the time. You're all on email all the time. So what's in place to protect you?
Passwords.
Yeah, things like passwords, things like firewalls, things like secure servers on the side of the company, like Amazon. Not anyone can just walk into the Amazon cloud storage, like the physical location tied to the cloud storage, and not anyone is just allowed to log in. So there's all these things in place. But what can happen if if the firewall isn't good? Or if the password program is such that it can be overridden, if there's like a master password they can log into any account, what can start to happen?
You can get hacked.
Yeah, so it can get hacked and your information can get stolen. So yeah, so one of the things is, just like in another case, so a doctor, one life is on the line, but when a big company gets hacked, very often it's like millions and millions of people's information gets stolen. So like your credit card and social security, name and address, 4 things which are very important to you. If 50 million people's all that information is stolen, and maybe also a picture of you, that is a really big deal. That is really high stakes. So here's another case. It's not just that computer professionals, like other professionals, can only be identified by well, just like a doctor, only another computer professional can tell whether an IT job is getting done right. And just like a doctor, when things go wrong, the stakes can be really high with identity theft. But even think about this even more. What other things run on computer systems these days? Just think about how much of your life is running on a computer system. How do you sign up for classes?
Through Zoom.
Through
Oh no, I'm sorry.
You attend class through Zoom. So imagine what would happen if you had a test that we were, or like an oral exam we were conducting through Zoom, and Zoom just stopped working because of a bug in the system. You can't attend school. You cannot get credit. What would happen? Another one is signing up for classes. How do you sign up for classes?
CUNY first.
CUNY first, yeah. Which always seems, how many of you have had that lovely experience in which you try to sign up for classes, something goes wrong for CUNY first, takes them 4 days to fix it, and by the time you get back, the classes are all full.
Yep.
Yep. I feel like this is, and why is this the case? Well, that's only affecting a small number of students in like the grand scheme of things. But if you're one of those students who can't graduate because there was this data problem, every once in a while it shuts down. So now we're talking about personal lives, your individual life, identity theft. But what other things run on computer systems? How is it when you go to the, here's the thing, where do you get your power? When you turn on the lights, what happens? They turn on. Why? Electricity. Where does that electricity come from?
The power grid.
The power grid. Mm-hmm. What's the power grid? Well, it's a collection of wires all going back to a power production plant. Therefore, there's somewhere in this state where coal or natural gas or nuclear or atoms are broken or broken apart, or water is used. All of these things, that's where our power comes from. What would happen if we all lost power?
Oh,
well,
nobody can do anything really. And then there's also the issue if you don't protect the power system, it's pretty much kind of over, because people can either send nukes, if it can get into there, which most likely they can. But there's a video on people hacking into the power plant or like a power station, where they could basically shut down the whole country.
Yeah, here's the thing. Most of our power plants today involve computer technology. So for instance, this is a nuclear power plant. You know, it's the things that look like this, and there's little atoms getting broken up, and it makes a lot of nuclear waste. Now, to do these breakdowns that create the power, things need to be held within a fraction of a degree. If it goes too high, the power plant melts down, and then we have a giant nuclear disaster. Are people familiar with Chernobyl? What is Chernobyl?
Yes.
Anyone know?
Basically, it was a nuclear power plant in Russia where I forgot how it went wrong, but it just went wrong, and then now it's still abandoned because it's too hot. The radiation levels are too high,
Yeah.
and then really nobody can go in there.
Yeah.
Like there are some people that do it, but it's
Chernobyl
not
is a city which is, I think at the time was in Russia, now is in the Ukraine, or I guess was in the Soviet Union. It had a nuclear power plant. In the 80s, there was a meltdown. And to this day, like 30 plus years later, no humans can go there because the radiation levels are too high. These days, those nuclear power plants are run on computer systems, running code that keep everything running correctly, and are being kept protected by firewalls and cybersecurity systems. If somebody wanted to get into one of those systems and there was a gap in the security system, you could literally cause a nuclear meltdown. It's also possible with the right stuff, because all of these things are hooked up to computer systems, it's theoretically possible to shut down all the power in an entire area in the United States just by hacking into the system. And if you look at what's happening in Texas right now, that's what it looks like when power goes out. It's an absolute disaster. And all of this is all these things could happen because it's all connected to computer systems. So as more and more and more things are hooked up to computer systems, more and more things can go wrong. So also there's worries, there are many different things about self-driving cars, but one of the worries that people had about putting self-driving cars on the roads is they could theoretically be hacked, and somebody could take control of your car from a distance and crash it and cause an accident. Also things like, bridges, like getting through the tolls on bridges, something like lifting up the little arm, that is computer control. Just think about how much trouble it would be if somebody just shut down all the toll booths computer systems. Like, it would be absolute chaos, and that's just toll booths. So the more things that are hooked up to computers, the more can go wrong. And theoretically, if we were to lose an entire computer system that controlled our water or our energy, New York City would just shut down and it would be complete chaos. So that's another reason why IT cyber professional ethics for this area is so important, is just like the other areas, if not more so, the stakes are incredibly high. There's an argument to be made that making a good, successful sort of firewall on a power grid is has higher stakes than a doctor performing surgery. All right, so everyone on board with why there has to be professional ethics for IT and why this is important. All right, so here, however, is a big difference. Remember I was saying with doctors and lawyers, there are these organizations that allow you to get your license. You have to pass certain tests. There's a governing body that decides who's allowed to work in this field, who's not. So do those things exist for cyber technology and computer programming?
Yes.
And how so? To what degree, and what powers do they have?
A lot of certifications where basically it'll prove that that you actually know the stuff, and then also it kind of allow some of them kind of allow you to practice it, I guess, because there's a lot of legal issues when you do something like hacking, like say, so you have to take, there's an ethical hacker certification from TIA. I don't know how to pronounce it, but yeah, there's one of those. But it's mostly just to make sure you know what you're legally able to do by yourself, and so you can't just hack, like, say example Target, like Target's website, like just for the hell of it, to just try it. You'll get arrested pretty much, or like fined or whatever.
Yeah, so on the one hand, and this is actually a good thing about professional ethics, is especially in the case of IT, is more and more there are coming to be certifications that you have to pass if you want to work in a field. The thing is, though, that very often it's still the case that these sorts of certifications are only the government, well, who's in charge of making sure that you have these certifications? Who decides whether you're allowed to have a job if you do or don't have one of these certifications?
That's the employer.
Yeah, very often it's the employer. So just to draw it, so here's a hospital. The hospital wants to hire a doctor. This is you as the doctor. You have to prove that you have the correct training. And who decides whether you've passed the correct training or not? Who decides whether this hospital is allowed to hire you? Is it the hospital? Who decides whether you've passed the test?
The recruiter?
Say
No,
that
it's
again.
not.
The recruiter. I mean, the person that is trying to hire you.
But they do, so in some sense the recruiter, but if the recruiter decides you're great for the job, but you haven't passed the board exam, are they allowed to hire you? No.
No.
So who has the final say? Who's overlooking it? The governing board or the governing body. So they get to look and they have the power of saying yes, no. So even if you're like, no, at our hospital, we don't care if you're board certified. The government's going to step in and say, we don't care if you don't care. You have to make sure that's the case. So in this case, at the end of the day, there's this outside body that oversees the whole thing. This is like that's the worst eyeball ever, but you get the idea.
Professor.
So this person looks over, and this is the governing body. Now, once we go over to IT, so you have to take a test, and that test goes up here. Now, in IT, you do take a test. So this is you as a computer programmer, and you take this test. Now, if you pass the test, yay, you passed it. Now, this is the company that's hiring you, company. They hire you and they see you pass the test. But if they decide, you know what, we don't care if you pass the test, we're going to hire you anyway, what happens?
They can hire you, no
They
problem.
hire you anyway.
Yes.
Because there isn't this oversight body. There's no one looking over the shoulder. So what companies are starting to do is ensure that their employees take this test. But it is still not mandated from the outside in the way that it is for doctors and lawyers. And in large part, well, there's a couple reasons for this. Anyone know what these reasons are? Why is it that there aren't these sorts of governing bodies in comparison to doctors and lawyers? There's two main reasons. First one, how long have doctors been around?
Years,
Since
centuries.
Centuries.
the beginning of times.
Yeah. How long have lawyers been around?
Centuries also. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe millennium. Yeah.
Centuries, millennia in both cases. How long have computer professionals been around?
A few decades. A few decades.
And so that's one of the major differences is these sorts of things take a while to get up and running. Like it used to be the case that if you could convince somebody you knew how to cut into them, they'd let you be a doctor. If you could convince somebody that you knew how to argue, they'd let you be a lawyer. It took centuries for this stuff to get into place. With computer professionals, it's so new that the infrastructure around it hasn't come into place yet.
Yeah, Professor, can I say something?
Yeah,
I'm sorry,
absolutely.
and also is a profit motive. You know, if you are productive, it doesn't matter if that you don't have the certification. You are productive.
Excuse me. So yeah, here's another thing is because these things aren't in place. And Cynthia, I'm gonna come to your point in 1 second. So one thing that's tied in here with this is because the company is the one deciding, there end up being, and this is really the main issue with this work. Actually, Jorge, let me finish what I was going to say on the first thing, then come back to your point because it's one I really want to highlight. And then I'll also talk about Cynthia's point, which is, actually, let's bring up Cynthia's point right now. She says you can generalize more with doctors and lawyers because they seem to have they seem broader than computer professionals. And I think there's something to this. With computer professionals, there are so many coding languages and the sorts of things that you need to do in one area aren't necessarily the same as another. Now, I think the same case could be made for lawyers and doctors, where there are specialty law things and there are specialty medical things that you need specialized people within that field. But I do think that there is an argument to be made that generally computer science is very focused. But then there's another issue, which is something we're going to be coming back to over and over and over again this semester, which is another reason why it's so hard to get a governing board up and applied to computer technology. All right, so if you're a doctor and you're working on surgery or patients or anything like that, what are you usually dealing with in your everyday life, and where do you go, and what are you doing, and who are your clients, and describe your relationship to them in terms of space. Before COVID, when you were a doctor and you were seeing a patient, what was it like? This was a really roundabout way of just asking, describe a trip to the doctor's office.
Less waiting.
Say that again. Sorry, I lost you for a sec. You cut out. Probably on my end.
Usually meet them at a hospital or a clinic.
Yeah, you go to a particular physical location and you interact with them. So here in New York, let's just pick a hospital. Let's say you're going to like a branch of Mount Sinai. You go to Mount Sinai in a physical place. Physical NYC office. You're in physical NYC office. Therefore, the rules that govern your behavior there are what rules? Who's in charge of deciding what you are and aren't allowed to do in this physical space?
The doctors, like aides and or the people who work at the front desk, pretty much, in the security guards.
So the people who are physically in the office is one, and then there are certain rules that they don't have control over. Who decides those rules? Like, you're not allowed to walk into a hospital with a gun. Who's in charge of making those rules?
Government.
Yeah, the government, the New York City government, which answers to the New York State government, which falls under the jurisdiction of the United States. So in a case of a professional, you are dealing with a particular physical location for something like a doctor. So, which laws do you have to pass to practice law in New York City? Well, you need to pass the laws for the United States and the ones that are applied in New York in particular. However, what's the difference with computer technology companies? What is the major difference with computers that isn't the case with things like being a doctor? If you're coding for someone, where can you code for them from?
From home or from an office? Or...
Do you have to be in the same country?
Right. Oh.
No. Do you have to be in the same, in theory, would you have to even be on the same planet?
No, if you can have the connection.
Yeah, as long as you have the internet connection, you can do that anywhere. And why is this a problem when it comes to finding governing bodies to govern over a field like computer technology?
Because I guess different countries have different laws,
Absolutely. So here's the case. If you're a company who's making computer software, what laws do you have to follow and what rules do you have to follow while you're making that software? Well, the issue is that it depends on where you're making it. It depends on where your customers are, and it depends on where your headquarters are as a company. And depending on what exactly you're doing, the rules change. So for instance, in the United States of America, our laws around privacy of consumer data are very different from the laws in Europe. And we'll come back to this later in the semester. So if I want to send you like spam emails in the United States, as long as you give me your email address, I'm allowed to keep sending that to you. If I'm in Europe, if I do not have explicit spelled out consent, I have to remove you from my mailing list. And if I try to send you an email, I will get fined for this. Jorge.
I was just going to add to that big companies or small companies take advantage of this to exploit this,
Exactly.
To create profit. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so the reason they're able to exploit this, and the reason why you can't have a governing body, is governing bodies always fall under the jurisdiction of a law. And this goes back to the punishment. Who punishes you if you break the laws of the Medical Association of America? Well, the United States government does. If you break the bar exam, or if you like go against the Bar Association of New York State, New York punishes you. But if you are an employee living in South Africa, working for an American company for clients living in Japan, if you go against, like, where would this governing body have to be based? Whose laws would they do? Who would punish if somebody breaks the law? If you put in these rules in place that say you're only allowed to go back to our example here, if you work for a company that's like, you know what, to take this, to work for our company, our cybersecurity company, you have to take an ethical test to prove that you're an ethical hacker and that you understand the things you are and aren't allowed to do. And this is a certification. But we here at this company decide you don't have to take it. You don't have to take the test. We don't care. Now, if you're working for this company, which is based in America, but you live in the UK and are working for clients in Germany, who would punish you for making this decision? The company might not. Why isn't the company going to punish you? And this goes back to Jorge's point from before. What is the company's number one concern here?
Profits.
Profit. If you are the best computer programmer who churns out twice as much code as everyone else, they're not necessarily going to care whether you've passed this silly test that nobody's going to punish them for. So they're not going to hold you accountable. The German government isn't going to hold you accountable because that's where the clients are, but they don't, as long as you're not meeting they weren't the ones who passed this governing body law, so they don't care. The American government might not hold you accountable because they're going to say, well, the company's here, but you're not working here. If you're working in the UK government might say, well, the company's based in America, so we really don't care. And what ends up happening is we don't end up with anything like a governing body. And the tests that are in place to make sure that you're behaving well, there's not the same sort of punishment in place because of this complex series of different sorts of things. So does everyone understand how, on the one hand, computer technology is a profession like any other, and it has ethical questions like any other, but it doesn't have the infrastructure built around it that is in place for all of these other sorts of technology, or all these other sorts of professions?
Yeah, Professor, I wanted to add something else to what you were saying, that sometimes the punishment is so weak that for a company, just to break like some rules and pay, like this little, I guess, how do you call them? Like fines is worth to break the law because the fine is so small that you make so much more money that is okay. Like from your point of view.
And this is something we're going to be coming back to again and again, is if you or I got $100 million fine, we would be screwed. Like if I were fined $100 million, I would never see a cent again in my life. But if Jeff Bezos gets fined $100 million, how much money does the man have?
200 billion?
Yeah, billions. Also, here's a fun fact. Let's do some simple math because we all know billion is a lot of money. But just thinking about how much money it is. So how many of you would be happy making $100,000 a day?
I'd be very happy.
Wow.
How many days would it take you to earn if you earned $100,000 a day? Or actually, let's go with this one. How many of you would be happy if you made $100,000 a year? Let's just go with a year. I would be perfectly content if that was my yearly salary.
Definitely,
If somebody told me, here, you get 6 figures a year for the rest of your life, I'd take that like that.
Yeah, nowadays, yes.
Yeah, anyone know if you earned $100,000 a year, how many years it would take you to earn $1 billion? It's a simple math problem, but we don't usually stop and think about it. So to earn this, it would have to be, let's count how many zeros we'd have to add to get to $1 billion.
Isn't it 10,000 years?
Yeah, it's 10,000 years. If you made $100,000 a year, to get to $1 billion, you'd have to make $100,000 for 10,000 years. If that's the money difference here, 10,000 years. Human society, we haven't had writing for 10,000 years. We got writing about 5,000 years ago. So we have to go back to when we were living in caves, making $100,000 a year to get to $1 billion. So if you're somebody like Jeff Bezos, who has $50 billion, $100,000 isn't a big deal. So if you're a company in which, like, even if there is a punishment in place for breaking the law, so if you violate privacy laws, you end up, you know, we here at Amazon have to pay $100 million to the government for this fine. Well, if your profits are, you know, 5 billion a year, that's literally nothing. The equivalent would be you having to give away $1 of your yearly salary. And so in the grand scheme of things, this is another aspect with this sort of thing, is even in those cases in which there is punishment, though, and this is something we'll come back to later in the class, even when there are punishments tied to these things, very often it's hard to find a punishment that actually gets anyone to change their behaviors. So what we see here so we've got IT on the one side versus things like the law or medicine. And while they're both professions, only the ones over here really have the things in place to ensure that there's outside oversight of what's happening in the profession itself. So that leads to, well, some issues that come up. And some of these issues are things like, well, who then at the end of the day decides what's okay in IT? What is deemed an acceptable amount of risk? What is deemed an okay sort of, like, what sort of qualifications do you have to have? Who is deciding that this is the case? Who's the number one decider of what sort of person should work at Google?
The company itself.
Google is. So this creates this conflict of interest where if you are able to help Google as a company well enough, very often the sorts of things that might come up in a situation like law or medicine don't always get considered. And this is a major issue in things like cyber technology. And this is why you hear things like Facebook coming into conflict with the US government and the Australian government. So have people been following what's been happening this week between Australia and Facebook? Anyone follow what happened here? Anyone want to give a shot at explaining what happened? Anyone who does know? So basically, this is a little side note, but basically what happened is that Facebook decided, so since the beginning of time, Facebook has judged that if you post something on Facebook, you don't have to pay the company that it came from originally. So if you go onto Facebook and you post a link to a New York Times article on your Facebook, it's being hosted by Facebook, but Facebook has never paid the New York Times back for this because their thought is, we're just a repository where people can place their own links. We shouldn't have to pay. This week, the Australian government put into practice, or they're working to put into practice, a law that says, no. If you want to post something on, like, if Facebook hosts it, Facebook has to pay the company it's from. So what Facebook has done in response is just cut off all news stories being posted to Australian Facebook. So you cannot access or post anything that Facebook deems a news story. And the issue has been things where lots of things which are not news stories are getting included in it. So if somebody posts like a link to, like, here's a case. We are opening a new cancer center. Our cancer center, we're going to post on our website a story about our cancer center. We are going to post, like, this is our new cancer center. It will open on this day. Here's where we got all the funding. Please come and start donating or using our services. Facebook has deemed that a news story and shut it down. So because of this, Facebook is in a major fight with the Australian government, where the Australian government is saying you should have to pay to post these news stories. You're making huge amounts of profit off of other people's work. And Facebook's saying, we don't like that because we are just hosting this, and our entire business model demands that we are allowed to do this, the only way we can make money is we're not paying these other companies. And therefore, if you want to make us do this, we are not going to play ball. And it's causing complete chaos in Australia right now, where large numbers of companies who are doing things like ad campaigns, they've paid for ad campaigns on Facebook because that's one of the major ways you advertise, and yet nobody's able to see their ad campaign because it's being judged a news story. It's having this other very strange side effect, which the only things that aren't being blocked are conspiracy theories, because those don't qualify as news. So the only things people are seeing are these conspiracy theory websites, which is this very weird thing. So the only ones that are making it through are the conspiracy theories. Marcus.
Oh no, I was gonna ask. Wait, you're talking about advertisements, or you're talking about like, oh, somebody just posting a link onto their like
So
wall?
posting a link onto it. So they'll pay some company to like come up with PR speak news story or like PR speak advertisements. So they'll post on their own page like, here, come and check out our new website, link to the website. But they paid another company who knows how to write these things to do it. So they paid another company, and now nobody can see those things. And instead, the only things that people are seeing are like, 9/11 was an inside job, because that's not deemed a news story.
It's
So,
kind of theoretically impossible, I guess, to do to actually like govern that. Because if you think about it, if everything's deemed a news story by them, and then you have like what you post a link to Reddit, and then that's a news story, and like it's theoretically impossible to like actually like govern that.
And so I think this is what Facebook's argument is. And so what Facebook's trying to do, their approach is basically something like, Australian government, you're playing hardball. Well, we're going to play hardball back. And we're going to show you that we are so important to you as a nation that without us, you cannot function as the nation you have been functioning as. Therefore, you're going to have to accept that we can't tell any news, what's a news story from what's not a news story, so nobody should get paid. So that's what they're trying to do here. And you might look at this and say, well, isn't that fucked up? But, the only people who have the power to stop Facebook from doing this are Facebook, because there's no international board of regulations, and there's nothing really that is controlling them in this sort of situation. So everyone, yeah,
I was just wanted to add something else. Also, like Facebook does have like monopoly on like a social media platform, because whenever another media platform like appears, they buy it, So.
And this is another major issue that's coming up. And actually, in terms of these sorts of things about professional ethics and the law around these big companies, this is one of the most fascinating times in history, because countries are starting to get upset about it and start threatening to put restrictions on these companies. And the companies are going to fight back tooth and nail. And because Facebook is so wealthy and Amazon is so wealthy, Amazon's annual income, their annual profit is more than many countries. So like they can literally go toe to toe with certain governments, and it's going to be an actual interesting legal battle that we'll be talking about. I'm sure it'll be progressing throughout this semester, because the Biden administration, I think, has shown some indication of wanting to try to go rein in these companies. So we will be coming back to this stuff all semester. And because they're so powerful, exactly as Jorge said, you can't read Australian news. Yeah, everything is like an absolute disaster down here with the Australia situation and Facebook. But yeah, it's something we'll be coming back to. And part of the reason that these are such big problems is because there weren't governing bodies and things in place, and there weren't laws governing these sorts of behaviors. A lot of the very first companies very quickly became monopolies because they had so much money to buy up their competitors. It basically Facebook became the first very successful social media site, which allowed them to buy everybody else that was trying to break in, therefore ensuring that they would continue to be super powerful. So that's the background of all these things. Now, I don't want to paint a completely pessimistic picture, because the fact is that these days there seem to be two main things. It's not like every company is the fictional evil company. There are certain, a lot of companies do questionable things, but also there are a lot of companies that behave morally and ensure that their employees behave morally. And there are really two main mechanisms in place that keep companies and keep organizations, and especially employees within those organizations, behaving somewhat okay. So does anyone know what these two sorts of things are?
Contracts.
Say that again?
Contracts.
Yeah, contracts, or what we're going to be calling codes of conduct. And so what is a code of conduct or a contract? Well, you signed one when you joined John Jay, or whenever you join a company. It's a piece of paper that you're given when you begin that is told, these are the things we accept at this company, and these are the things we do not accept at this company, and here's how you're expected to behave. And so these obviously have a lot of value and have a lot of power, and are really important to have in place. So what are the benefits of these sorts of codes of conduct? And the book lays out 5. Let's see if I can pull them up. I can get my computer to turn on. That's a great question. All right. So one of the main things about a code of conduct is it literally just educates employees about what they are and aren't allowed to do at the company. And so this is a good way to make sure that nobody kind of goes off the rails and starts doing totally inappropriate stuff at that company. It tells you, like, this is what you are and aren't allowed to do. What are some other things that codes of conduct do? So for typical examples, there are things like you have to wear, like at like a high school code of conduct, it was like you can't wear jeans that are, or like skirts that are above your knees, and you can't wear baseball caps and those sorts of things. So what are the other roles that codes of conduct play in a company? Or what are the benefits? Why do we want them? Yeah, they inform us or educate us on what is acceptable. What else is there? And these don't have to be the ones from the book. You can just take stabs of why is it that these things are valuable? Yeah, hold people accountable. So here's another issue. If you work for a company and they never tell you what you are and aren't allowed to do, like say there's a case in which, you know, you've been using your personal computer breaks, and you've been using your company computer to download WandaVision illegally. So you're downloading WandaVision illegally, and on the company computer. Well, if they don't tell you you're not allowed to do that, they can't go, hey, we're firing you for this. But if there's a code of conduct in place, they can now go, hey, this doing this thing on our company computer goes against the codes of conduct that you agreed to. Therefore, we are going to be allowed to fire you from this company. And you can see how in this case, it ensures that there's a certain level of behaviors that are acceptable within the company itself. So that's another thing it can do. It also provides you, tied in with accountability, you can punish people. So if you don't tell someone that they're doing something wrong, it can become a really sticky legal battle between the company and the employee. So if the employee does something really fishy and the company wants to fire them for it, if you never told them what they were doing was wrong, it can be very difficult to punish people who are taking advantage of the system. But if you have a code of conduct in place that says, like, this is what you are and aren't allowed to do, then this is the sort of thing that you're now able to do much more easily. Is you can fire people for behaving poorly in the company. Any other things that people want to say about these codes of conduct? There's a lot more we could say about them, but I'm going to cut it short because codes of conduct is not the most interesting thing. So these are like, I want to stress just how crucial and important they are. And companies that don't have them, we're getting more and more of these things in place because they are so valuable. Jorge.
I was gonna say, maybe the reasons that you apply this is also to, in order to like maybe have a better reputation.
Yeah. So here's another thing. Another reason, and this can be seen as a good or bad way, but one of the reasons that people want codes of conduct is it does kind of, it inspires or adds like a workplace value system. So people like working at places and work better if they feel an association with the company and feel like they're being treated well. So if you are able to say, like, our code of conduct has a rule that says we have a 0 tolerance policy for sexual harassment, and regardless of your position, if you are found making sexually inappropriate comments, you will be fired on the spot. Then if you work at that company, you can point to this and say, like, this is something which our company values, and I am proud to work at a company who values these things. I feel like I cut you off, Jorge. Did you have something else you wanted to say?
No, that was it, Professor.
Okay. So yeah, these are all very valuable things. Like these are not things to be laughed at. And this is why like a company that has no code of conduct, like it is a major problem and a major worry. But I do want to highlight the ways in which codes of conduct are not entirely perfect. So what are some of the issues that can come up with codes of conduct? Why is it that codes of conduct are not a perfect solution to all ethical behavior in the workplace or ethical behavior amongst professionals? Any takers?
Professor, maybe this is, I don't know, maybe because they're made by us, so new things also, come up, like ethics change throughout the times and.
Yeah, so those are the pluses. Let's go with the pluses of codes of conduct, and then here are the negatives. One issue is just they're written by the company themselves. The company writes them. And if the company writes them, what are the possible worries here? Well, even the best intentioned company can, like people who work at that company, every human being, like, sorry to tell you, none of you are perfect. Nobody's perfect and none of you are perfectly unbiased. Everyone has biases and nobody's perfect. Therefore, the people writing these rules are biased and imperfect. So no set of rules you're going to get is perfect. And what's more, what can often happen is the sorts of things that people care about are very often going to get written into the company codes of conduct. So for instance, sexual harassment is something which in the past decade has become a much more talked about issue in the workplace. Is sexual harassment in the workplace new?
No.
No, it's been around. It's if anything better now than it was. But this is something that has been a major, major problem. But why is it that it kept going on and kept happening?
Professor, I just wanted to say also, like these codes of conducts are written by this company, and they're like, in order to, I guess they're not really worried. I mean, it's my opinion, too much about the public, but they worry about themselves, so they're writing this to help the company, not the public.
Yeah,
That's
so
why they change with
so I
public
think
opinion as well.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And here's two things. One thing, so I'll come back to the self-interested bit, but the biased bit I want to start with, where a lot of times companies put things into their own codes of conduct, which are not designed to help the public or help the employees. And I'll come back to that in a second. But before we get to those, there are cases in which, so why was it that sexual harassment issues were usually not taken very seriously and were not punished very seriously in the workplace? Well, who was writing the codes of conduct? Who in the company is responsible for it?
Men, actually.
Yeah, it's usually the higher, like codes of conduct get written by the HR department, but they only really get enforced by people higher up. So it's people like the CEO, people like the CFO, people who are high up in the company. And as a matter of fact, in the United States still today, but even more so in past time, who was likely to be a CEO? Well, almost always it was going to be a man.
A white man, actually.
And not only just a man, but a white man. So therefore, things like sexual harassment and racial prejudice in the workplace were not really built into the codes of conduct, because if you're a white man, those things are not as obvious to you as they are to somebody who's dealing with them every day. So part of the reason that codes of conduct are not perfect is that these sorts of companies that were writing, the people who were writing the codes of conduct were the very people who didn't give a damn about this stuff, because they were the ones who weren't dealing with it. So one of the things that was happening across a lot of companies in the past, what has been happening basically since the Black Lives Matter protests began, is more and more companies are suddenly going like, oh shit, we have nothing about race in our codes of conduct. We need to change our codes of conduct to be in line with this stuff. So that's one of the things that has been happening. And that really shows that the codes of conduct, even the best intentioned people have blind spots. And because of this, like people who are not explicitly racist still might not realize like, oh, our workplace is not a safe environment for people of color. And so because of this, the codes of conduct ended up biased and allowed these things to continue. But another reason is sometimes people who are writing the codes of conduct are not just worried about, are not well-intentioned people making mistakes. Sometimes the codes of conduct are actively designed to help the company as opposed to those working for the company or for the public. So what is the classic case of this? Well, an NDA. What is an NDA? Anyone know?
Isn't
Non-disclosure
that,
act.
Yeah, non-disclosure act or non-disclosure agreement. And what does it do or how does it work?
Basically, if you sign it, you can't release anything confidential by the company. Basically, this is where it gets into whistleblowing.
it
Yeah.
censors the workers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, what it basically is, it's a contract that you sign at a company. And these days, just about every company has some non-disclosure agreement built into it. And what it says is things like, you are not allowed to talk about anything related to the job outside of the job. And so you are not allowed to discuss our practices. You're not allowed to discuss the projects you're working on. You're not allowed to discuss who is working on it. And different companies have different degrees of NDAs. Now, the issue with this is what? Well, the reason the company is doing this is because it's supposed to prevent you from saying anything which is going to hurt the company and allow their secrets to get out into the world. So it benefits the company. It does not necessarily benefit you. Another thing that is often built into contracts these days are called non-compete clauses. Do people know what a non-compete clause is?
Or that you won't work for a company that's a direct, it is competing with you directly.
Yeah, so basically what it is the company writes into your contract, if you leave this company, you will not be able to work for another company working in this field for a minimum of 5 years or something like that. And the laws around non-competes are up in the air. Some states won't allow them. Other states have long ones. Other states have short ones. But basically, the idea that the company tries to do is, the reason these are built into the codes of conduct or the contract is they want to make sure that if you are working and all the skills you gain at that company, don't then go and work for another company. So on the one hand, you can understand from the company's point of view why you want this. If you train someone and give them all the skills and they've been working on a project for years for your company, and right before it's finished, they go to another company and work for them, you as the company lose out. However, the issue is, as the employee, depending on how much a similar company, how broad the definition is, you can be kept out of getting, like you can get fired, and depending on or you can, if you leave the company for perfectly reasonable reasons, you can then be prevented from trying to get a job somewhere else, or it can become much more difficult. So these are things that can get built in. Also, very often, companies these days have social media elements built into the contract. So for instance, if you work for a retailer, it will very often be built into your contract. You are not allowed to say bad things about the company on your social media pages. So if you have a bad day at work working for, I don't know, McDonald's, you're not allowed to go onto your Instagram and post like a McDonald's sucks banner. That's technically, they could fire you for that. And again, this is not something that is in any way like built into the law. Like the law does not say that McDonald's is or isn't allowed to do this, or that you aren't allowed to do this. It's rather the company has decided that you aren't allowed to do that, and it's for the perfectly self-interested reason of they don't want the negatives of their company being posted to social media. Jorge, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, Professor.
Okay. So does everyone understand, like, the positives of codes of conduct are great. But they also have some negatives here. And so one thing that has actually happened here recently, and this is something that I want to talk about, both the positives and negatives of it, is these days it's come to be the case that there's really a second principal put in effect that operates on these same sorts of things and works to make companies behave more ethically. And so sometimes it's the companies working from the inside, like creating codes of conduct, but there's really a second mechanism that is very active these days that prevents companies from, or holds employees accountable and holds companies accountable for themselves and for their employees' behaviors. So what is this second mechanism I'm alluding to? Anyone know? I'll put a name up here and let's see if you all know who I'm talking about. All right.
Snowden?
So not Snowden, you're actually a step ahead of me, Marcus. I don't know if I'm spelling her name right. Gina Carano. Who is this? Why am I putting her name up here? Anyone know? Star Wars, yes. Who is Gina Carano? She's a former MMA fighter who was most recently played a character in The Mandalorian. Why am I putting her name up here? What recently happened to her?
Oh, she recently got
she got
fired
fired.
from Disney. I don't remember the reason why, but I think she posted something on Instagram talking about, I don't remember what was the reason, but she got fired because of that.
Yes, she posted her personal views on Instagram. Those views compared the exact lines of the view were comparing being a Republican in the United States today to being Jewish during the Holocaust. That was what the statement was. It was her opinion. Within 24 hours of her posting that to her Instagram, she was fired by Disney, who has said we have nothing to do with her for anymore. Her contract has been terminated. Her all toys of her character no longer will be produced, and various other things. So what is on display in this sort of case? What was it that led this woman to be fired? Was it a code of conduct thing or what? Guys.
No, it's just like I was just about to say that it's kind of scary. Like at this point, just to share your thoughts, because you can get fired for any reason.
Public opinion. And so these days, one thing that has happened in the United States especially is because we don't have these practices, like we don't have governing bodies over computer technology and IT, and because we don't have a lot of, especially in things like, to go with another case, like Facebook is not being controlled as to what you're allowed to put on your Facebook page and what you're not. Twitter's got this sort of thing too, where outside of starting like saying things that cause a major national monument to get invaded, you're not going to get kicked off Twitter for saying most sorts of things. So what very often happens, so there's no real control in social media in these ways, and a lot of companies don't get rid of people until something comes out and public opinion shifts. And so what ends up happening, one of the major forces today is because there's been this vacuum of like, the companies aren't stopping people, what ends up happening is that when people do something, there's a major public opinion response. And once there's that public opinion response and companies start worrying about like how they will be perceived if they keep this person on, then the company will fire them. So there's this very strange thing in which instead of it being the company themselves deciding or the law deciding, it's rather that people get upset enough and the company decides it is not a viable strategy to keep this person employed. So what are the positives of this and what are the negatives of this? This is also often referred to as what? Cancel culture. So by cancel culture, we mean if you say something people don't like, then you get fired or you get let go or you get canceled. So what are the positives of cancel culture? What are the advantages to having a culture in which when you say something nasty, you get your platform taken away? Marcus.
It's pretty like some positives is that it stops the person who like does like stuff like let's say like that I forgot one Twitch streamer actually shot a gun, like he unloaded the gun supposedly, and then apparently he like but then he shot it, and then but there was still a bullet in it, and then his whole Twitch career basically got canceled, which is his job. And then there's like what James Charles, a bunch of other people who got cancel cultured because of like some problematic statements. And like, but there's a lot of cons to it too, where like you could cancel culture could be like really, really bad if the allegation was fake, and then they got canceled because they now ruined their career for no, and then like because like there's a lot of people who make charges against like former like relationship partners or whatever, and then like they try to cancel each other, and then like it becomes a whole mess of that.
Yeah.
And
So
also, Professor, I
Go
just
ahead.
wanted
Yeah,
to
yeah.
add that sometimes, like you have done something that maybe you change your opinion on, maybe like 10 years ago, and then it surfaces again, and they want to cancel you for that. So that's like another, I think, negative. Because
yeah, those are major issues. Yeah, so a lot of people, and I really don't, the pros are pretty obvious. The pros are things like you stop somebody from saying deeply hateful things that make people mad. Like if somebody's running around on the internet just throwing the N-word everywhere, that is inappropriate and going to hurt a lot of people deeply and be very troubling and make the internet somewhere where people of color do not want to be. That is a problem. So on the one side, cancel culture does, like in a lot of ways, value people, and it's a way of making sure that things that are truly hateful are less likely to be said. But the cons are very strong as well. One of the things is, yeah, there's no fact checking. When somebody says something like, this person did this to me, very often, what happens is, even before it's been checked, this story starts going around. So it'll be something like, I heard that this person did this. And then the next thing you know, you end up with, so like, what happens? Well, somebody says something like, well, Hillary Clinton is running a child pornography ring out of a pizza place. Then it passes to somebody else. Then it passes to somebody else. And by the time somebody comes along to go, well, you know what? Are we really sure that the Democrats are running a child pornography ring? We end up with QAnon. So by the time anyone stops this sort of thing, what ends up happening is it can usually build so quickly because of the nature of the internet that by the time anyone bothers fact checking it, it is such a big, powerful thing that somebody's career can be ruined. Like if it were to turn out that the Gina Carano thing were a deep fake, to be clear, there's no evidence of that, 100% clear that she did do this thing. If that were to come out, it would be very difficult for her to resurrect her career. Or something else tied in with this, sometimes the thing people say were said like 12 years ago. How many of you would want to be held accountable for the things you did 12 years ago? Raise your hand if you would want the things you said 12 years ago posted on the internet and brought up. Like,
That would suck.
yeah, it would suck. And also, like, people change. Like, the things that I thought 10 years ago, a lot of them I look back and I'm like, wow, I was a complete dumbass. And I'm sure we all have these things. So if you're somebody who like said something racist 10 years ago, but have genuinely changed your views and say it's not the sort of thing, or like you said one thing that upset people, or you said it 10 years ago, but it is upsetting now. Like it depends on the situation, or it might be taken out of context. Now, I agree, Cynthia, that it depends on the severity. Like there are certain things that if you did them 10 years ago, I don't care how much you've reformed, I don't want you around. There are just certain things that are just like, yeah, just a little too much. But there are other things like, I mean, a classic case, and I really don't know. I think one of the areas that has led to the most discussion on this issue is like there are cases of politicians who appeared in blackface, but the photos are from like 70 years ago. On the one hand, you want to be like, dressing up in blackface is deeply offensive to a lot of people and is very upsetting. But also, this was 70 years ago. So I really don't know what I'm supposed to think in this case. Do I really want to hold someone accountable? Do I not want to hold someone accountable? And I think there's good arguments on both sides, and it really, you have to like, you can't just be like, there's a right answer. You have to talk to people. You have to find out how offensive it is. You have to see whether the people actually think there was something wrong with what they were doing. You have to understand the context. And I think like, if it's the sort of thing where like it deeply offends a lot of people, then I think even if that person 70 years ago didn't intend it, and it was 70 years ago, I think you might have to say, well, it's still wrong, and we might have to do something about it. Marcus, you wanted to say something.
I was gonna say that one example could be Robert Downey Jr. He did face a bunch of years ago for a movie, and then there was also Jimmy Fallon, which I don't know, I don't really like the whole cancel culture against him, because even though he did blackface, right, he got the permission of the guy he was impersonating, and he said it was fine, and yeah, then there's that whole issue of that.
And I think what this really highlights is just how difficult it is to define. Because like on the one hand, you want to say he got the permission, but then on the other side, you want to be like, well, there are going to be a lot of people of color who that is offensive to. And you didn't ask their opinion. So what right does Jimmy Fallon have to say, I'm going to ask one person? I think another classic case is just something like the N-word, where like the way in which it has been reappropriated in things like hip hop and rap, there are some people who are deeply offended by that still. And there are other people who are like, no, this is an important word that we have reclaimed as part of our heritage. And this is a very valuable, important thing. So I think a lot of these things, there's just not a clear-cut answer. And that's why there can be so many cons for cancel culture, is that very often it ends up like, you know, it can stand in the way of genuine discussions about these sorts of things. Question? Did somebody have a question?
Professor, I was just gonna say the same scenario happened with Charlie Hebdo in France.
Yes.
A few years ago, when they was doing the caricature of the prophet for Muslim.
That's a really good case. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the case, the Charlie Hebdo thing, it was a political cartoon that included a picture of the Prophet Muhammad in the cartoon, which is like deeply offensive to include an image of the Prophet. Many people found that deeply offensive. So in response, one of the things that happened was there was a shooting at the headquarters of people who were upset by this. And I think this is a case in which, on the one hand, you want to say like, free speech demands that you should be allowed to make political cartoons. But the flip side is this was so offensive to so many people. Like, I can't make a political cartoon in which I just use the N-word 100 times. Like, that would just, even if like it's free speech, it's still somehow deeply troubling. And the fact is, by having cancel culture, what can end up happening is we don't have the discussions around these sorts of things. Instead, somebody who does something gets canceled without any fact checking. And what can end up happening is people end up canceled for things that happened decades earlier. So one thing just like tied in with this cancel culture stuff is like, one thing to do before you do anything else, if there's one lesson to, Rihanna recently posted a picture offending a lot of people in India around the current issues going on around the regulations on farmers and that sort of stuff. So yeah, just about anybody stepping in is causing, and there's a worry of like, should we cancel Rihanna? Will she upset people? But on the other side, she was saying something political. I mean, another classic case is everything having to do with taking a knee and professional sports in this country. Is there was the push to cancel people for taking a knee. Then there was the push to cancel people who said that you shouldn't be allowed to take a knee. And so it's just and what ends up happening is people just end up saying, cancel this person, instead of discussing what actually has to get done. And so these are the sorts of issues that tie around cancel culture and free speech. I feel like I just cut somebody off, or I just needed a sip of water. Are we doing okay, everybody?
No, yeah, Professor, I just wanted to say something also with things that happened many years ago or even last month, like what you were discussing, like things change and like you could be ignorant about something and learn it afterwards. So you can, apologize for it, and you don't agree with 10 years ago anymore.
And this is part of the issue with the internet, is things get taken out of context. So what I wanted to say, the person I cut off was myself. The thing I wanted to say was that if there's one lesson to take away from this class, it's this. If you have a social media presence, And if you have pictures or photos or things on the internet that you did in your past that you are not proud of and you do not want associated with you, delete them now. Because when you apply for a job, they will look at your Facebook, they will look at your Instagram. Make sure that anything that's on there that you don't agree with now is not on there anymore. If you have a picture of yourself underage drinking, delete it. It's the sort of thing where, like, underage drinking, do I think it's a big deal? No. Do most people think it's a big deal? No. But if a company is worried about hiring someone who might lead to a PR problem down the line, that might be an issue. Just get rid of anything like that now. Make stuff private, like do yourself a favor, because the fact is that if you post it on the internet, somebody will find it. So just be aware of that. Always, it's also helpful every once in a while, just Google yourself. It just to see what comes up. If you want something, if you don't want something coming up that comes up, find out where it's from, ask them to take it down if it's possible. Just be aware that because of this cancel culture thing, the practical thing is assume it's going to continue and protect your own ass from it. That's just practical piece of advice number one. All right. Any other questions right now? We doing okay? All right, now I'm going to do my same question I had last time. It is currently 12:27. Break now or end at 1:15? How many people want to break now? How many people want to end early? All right, most of the votes are being for end early.
And early for me.
Okay, so I've heard no take a break now, and I've heard a lot of end early. So we're going to keep pushing through and end at 1:15. So if I'm still talking at 1:15, tell me to shut up, and I will send you on your way. All right, so there's two more things that I want to talk about this class. I want to talk about the second one first, because I think it ties in more neatly with, actually, no, they both tie in very neatly with, okay, so I'm going to talk about responsibility versus liability versus accountability. And then at the very end of class, I'm going to talk about whistleblowing. It's an interesting topic, but it's so open-ended that there's not really any conclusions to draw. So I'll end class that way with here's something to ponder over the course of the weekend. But the first thing I want to talk about is these notions of responsibility, liability, and accountability. And what these are tied in with is what's called the many hands problem. And why I'm bringing this up is because in professional ethics with companies today, there's a major issue that arises. And part of the reason why it's so hard for companies to engage in professional ethics and why it's so hard to put governing bodies in place for something like computer technology is the nature of responsibility and what we think it is to hold someone responsible. So what do I mean by holding someone responsible? Hold responsible. What does that mean in our everyday context? What is it to hold someone responsible for something?
Like if somebody murdered somebody, they're responsible for murdering that person.
Yes, so what we mean by it is in some sense, we hold them responsible as the cause for doing it, and also we think they should be blamed. So it's some sense of if you do a thing, you then have to be treated in a certain way. So a classic case would be murder. So let me draw a murder up here. So here's a person murdering somebody else. They're stabbing them with a strange shaped knife. They're very angry and they're murdering this poor person who's lying on the ground. So when they're killing this person, what do we think about this person here? The murderer. What do we say about them? Well, they're responsible for doing this. But what does that mean practically speaking? What does it mean if we hold this murderer responsible? What does that mean we do?
There needs to be consequences for
there
his
needs
actions.
to be consequences, or in this case, punishment. What else do we say about them? How do we feel about them?
We feel like we need to take him, like separate them from society.
Yeah, so they need to be punished. They need to be separated. Separated in some places, depending on the murder, you might say death penalty. But generally, just generally speaking, how do you feel about this person? Would you want to get dinner with them? No. Yeah, they're doing the wrong thing, or they are in some sense bad. And so when somebody commits a murder or does something, we have this strong negative reaction. We think they're bad, we dislike them, and we want them to be punished. That's what it means to hold them responsible. Now, what you actually find, though, when you look at responsibility, is it seems to break into multiple parts. It seems like there are multiple things that are responsible for our wanting this person to be punished and for us to think they're bad. And these things can come apart. So when would you be most upset with this person, and when should they be punished most harshly? Tell me things about this murder that make it the case that they should be punished most harshly and that we feel the worst about them. What can you tell me about the murder?
They just killed a man, so
They killed. Did they know what they were doing? In the worst
Most
possible
likely.
version. Yeah, in the worst possible version, yes, they did it on purpose. They did it intentionally.
Professor, sometimes it depends also like who the victim is that we feel stronger, or if
That's
it's a
another good
child,
one.
you know.
Is there reason behind it? Is there reasoning involved? If you were to find out, like, imagine that this person turns out that their child has been kidnapped. Their child's been kidnapped by a psycho killer who says, person, go murder a random person on the street, or else I'm going to skin your child alive. How do we feel about this person now? Do we think they should be punished as harshly as the person who's just like, I feel like killing a person?
no.
No.
But that depends on the person though, because yeah, that's all personal.
Yeah, so it's personal, but I think most people would say if you do it because somebody's holding your child hostage, it's not as bad. So what's the difference here? Well, it seems like what
Like
you're
motive, I guess.
Yeah,
Motive.
the motive matters. Did you mean to cause harm? What was your reasoning behind it? So that's one thing that goes into it, is motive. So if you, and this is another thing, so yeah, if it's self-defense, we have very different thoughts. And here's another thing, your motive matters. If you try to kill someone and fail, do you go to jail?
I think
Yes,
that
yes.
was
Yeah, you do.
yeah.
It's attempted
you-
murder.
Mhm.
So we care about the motive a lot. However, there's another element of it that we care about. If you try to kill someone and don't, you go to jail, but you go to jail for as long as if you succeed.
No,
No.
it's a different
No,
part.
in most places, it's attempted murder, not successful murder. So it seems like motive matters, and it also seems like the cause matters. So did you actually bring it about? And this is why also, what if you are like, driving along and you're driving to the hospital because your partner is in labor in the back and you're just speeding, and along the way you hit a pedestrian and kill them.
Oh,
In that case, would you go to jail? Yes, you would. But would it be for murder?
no.
It'd be unintentional.
It'd be manslaughter because it's not intentional. So what we find is that very often our feelings around negative stuff happening, it's tied in with motive and what we like, what was our aim? What were we trying to do? And what cause was there? Did you try to do it? And the clearest case of, and like in the United States, first degree murder, you have to, it's premeditated, i.e. you thought about it for a long time, you had motive, you did it, you had motivation, you thought about it, you really wanted this person dead, and you actually did the thing. So what we find is in cases where you are directly causally responsible, and when you actually intend to do something, we want to hold people more responsible for it. So everyone understands, this should be common sense stuff. Like every day, thinking about the way we hold people responsible for their actions, the more they intended it and the more they directly caused it, the more we hold them responsible. In the same way, if you accidentally save someone's life, we don't think you're a hero in the same way where if like you if you dive in front of a bullet intentionally and save someone's life, we're like, oh, you're a hero. Or a case in which a soldier So, like, what are you supposed to do if there's a grenade on the ground in amongst your fellow soldiers? You're supposed to jump on it so that you take the brunt of it. Well, if you jump on the grenade intentionally, we call you a hero. If you're very clumsy and you just so happen to fall on the grenade, like, yes, you saved a bunch of lives, but we don't consider you quite as good. You aren't as positively responsible either. So why am I bringing this up? Well, what we find is the more people that get involved in a process, and the more people or the more elements involved in causing something to come about, and the less each individual person involved seems to want the outcome, the less confident we feel that anybody is responsible for the outcome. And why is this a problem? What is the issue? So, like, just to give a clear case, imagine that, so here's a case in which, let's just say one of you gets really mad at me for your grade, stabs me and kills me. Pretty straightforward. We know each one of you, like whoever did the stabbing committed first-degree murder, you should go to jail. But imagine the following. Imagine that every one of you gets really mad at me for your grades, and none of you are happy with it. But none of you is so unhappy that you want to kill me. Rather, each one of you just decides, our professor deserves a little punishment. I'm going to give him a paper cut. So I'm just minding my own business, walking through the park. Nobody stabs me. Instead, 25 of you give me one paper cut. 25 times one paper cut. Nobody intends to do anything other than give me a paper cut. But imagine that from all those paper cuts, I bleed out and die. I don't have a red marker, so I'll bleed out in green. So in this case, what do we want to say? Who is responsible for my death?
It's still the students.
I think
So
all of them.
each one of you is somehow responsible. But is it appropriate to say that any one of you killed me?
No, it's the group, because like actually technically you could say it's all, because they kind of conspirated to
No,
do.
none of you talk to each other.
Oh, none of us.
Just totally by dumb happenstance, every one of you. So it seems like all of you are somehow responsible in some sense. And yet, would we want to send any of you to jail for first-degree murder? Like this, imagine that one of you just gets really mad, stabs me in the back, and I die. That person, we agree, first-degree murder. They should maybe spend life in jail. Should all of you who gave me a paper cut just because you thought it would be kind of funny, do you all deserve to go to jail for life?
No, I think it's less serious. It's probably like a fine or something, or like maybe like a record or a punishment in juvie, or maybe a couple months in jail. But like it's not that serious,
So
because like
thing.
you can't like, because it wasn't conspirated or anything, so it's fine.
So on the one hand, like I totally follow that sort of reasoning, and I think that that's kind of where my mind goes sometimes. But imagine that you're the judge and you have to tell my parents, hey, your son died and all of his students gave him a paper cut that caused him to bleed out, and we're going to give them a fine for it. How do you feel about that? Like my parents, like I love my parents. They're generally pretty reasonable people. But if they found out, yeah, they wouldn't be angry. They'd be absolutely pissed off. And you can imagine that case where you would probably, if you found out that your mother was killed because a bunch of people played a prank, the fact that it was a prank and they didn't intend to cause any harm to them other than like mild discomfort, that wouldn't really make you any happier. And not only that, if you found out that the punishment for accidentally killing someone by a paper cut was a $300 fine, would you be tempted? Like, would you really care if you then, like, the person who did it, would they do it again? I mean, maybe not. But at the very least, they'd certainly be more likely to do it than if they were told you're spending the rest of your life in jail. And so there's this other side of it, which is, in some sense, it's very clear in these sorts of cases, like who's responsible, who gets punished. In these sorts of paper cut cases, it's not at all clear what we should think. If somebody dies, we feel like there should be punishment, and the family of the person who died is going to want some sort of response. But how do you respond to it, and what sort of punishment is appropriate? It's not at all clear. Now, why am I bringing up paper cuts and murders in this class? What is the reason that I'm bringing this up in the professional ethics course or unit?
Basically, it's you can't, it's really what you wrote, responsibility versus liability versus accountability, is because like each thing applies to a certain group. So really, like people where I read the textbook where basically somebody made a machine with a chemical radiation treatment, and something went bad, and yeah, and then there's like a bunch of issues of who to blame. It's really the blame game.
That's exactly what, and that's exactly why I'm bringing it up, is because if you look at this case and you look at this case, which of these two looks more like a computer technology company? Is a computer technology a single united individual with a very clear sense of purpose and goals? Or is it a collection of independent people, each operating sometimes towards a greater goal, sometimes towards their own individual goals, but each of them doing something different that together can cause a greater result? Which is a computer technology company?
The 25 paper cut.
Yeah, a computer technology company is much more like the 25 paper cuts case. So there isn't like, it's not like a CEO is just up there going like, make a bad program. Rather, what can happen is you have a ton of different people, each of whom are responsible for some lines of code, each of whom has their own personal desires, their own personal flaws, their own propensity to make mistakes, their own hopes, their own fears. And when each of them falls in a different level in the company. And what we find is when something goes wrong and something goes terribly wrong, there's no one person where it looks like we have to hold this one person accountable. So for instance, in the case in which this medical technology, the case Marcus was talking about, there was a piece of medical technology that released radiation for cancer treatment, and it was supposed to release very small amounts of radiation. And instead, it released what were very, very large amounts, and multiple people died from this radiation. When they found out about it, they went back and they looked, and it turned out that there were a whole bunch of bugs in the code. No one bug was catastrophic, but all of them working together was catastrophic, but nobody knew which technician was responsible for which bugs. No one was quite sure which department failed to collect it, and no one was really sure whether the CEO put unreasonable timetables on it or what. So we have a case in which there seems to be a crime committed. There seems to be a problem here. We have 10 dead people, which means 10 unhappy families. And yet we don't have anyone we can say that person should go to jail. Not only that, for anyone you choose, it seems like sending them to jail might be a harsh punishment. So there's this weird thing in which we have these crimes in which nobody, you don't get angry at any particular person, even though there's 10 dead people. If I told you my neighbor murdered 10 children, you'd be infuriated and you'd be like, that neighbor needs to go to jail. If I tell you there was a malfunction in this computer software and 10 people died, you might get very unhappy that 10 people died. But then I ask you, well, who are you angry with? And it's not at all clear who you should be angry with or how they should be punished. So what this means, or what I'm pointing to here, is it looks like in contexts in which we have many people tied in with these issues, with any particular outcome, what ends up happening is our notion of moral responsibility seems to break down. It seems like we don't have anyone to punish. We don't have anyone to blame. It's just like bad stuff happens, and therefore we don't know who to punish for it. So what's the worry about this? What is the major issue that comes up if we don't feel strongly about these things like moral responsibility? If in these cases we can't hold someone responsible, why is this a big issue?
It's basically because you can't really hold. Oh, so basically with the whole came up thing, it was I think it was two software bugs and a hardware bug or a hardware failure with the switch. And it's basically like, who do you blame? The programmers, the person who built the machine, like faulty parts? Like, is it really like did they intend to do this, or was it just like a bad thing? Because it's basically accountability, because you account you hold the the people who make the thing accountable, I guess, or the company that makes the product accountable. But also at the same time, with liability, I think it really depends, because liability, like, oh, you could just write in the code of conduct, oh, like whatever, blah blah blah. You're as soon as you own the product, you're responsible, right? So that's like that type of thing. And then, like, can you really punish the programmers with liability? Because like it's not really their fault that or I guess it is kind of their fault, but at the same time it's not really, because things do happen and things go wrong, and like that's human. So you can't really, like, do you really want to hold the people who made that software or whatever accountable, like if they couldn't find it?
Yeah, it seems like what we want to do is, when we think about all of this, we don't want to say that this person caused it and is fully responsible. And this, instead, we want to kind of fall back on these other two notions, is kind of our inclination. And I'm going to talk about these in 1 second. But the basic idea is, why is it a problem if we don't hold people responsible? Well, part of the way in which we get satisfaction, like everybody loves a good revenge story. Like, why is it that we love a good revenge story? Well, there's something deeply humanly satisfying about something bad happens to you and you get revenge on the person who did that thing. So like, there's something deeply satisfying, and especially for the people who are victimized. Like, if your family member dies, you want the person who caused it to see justice. Like, our intrinsic desire for justice demands this. And the worry is, if we get rid of responsibility as a notion, the loved ones, the family members, get no justice. So one of the worries, in these situations in which responsibility breaks down, it seems like one of the worries that you have is you never get recompense, you never get that justice. Another issue, however, leads to extreme risk taking. So one of the other worries that you have is, why is it that part of the reason is we like to do the right thing. Like, most of us have some desire to do the right thing. But like, if you're in a major hurry and you need a snack and you're at like the CVS, but you don't have time to stand on the line, what prevents you from stealing a candy bar in a lot of cases? Why don't you steal a candy bar when you're hungry? Other than the fact that you're a good person. Yeah, punishment. You're worried about getting punished. So one of the worries is, our notion of responsibility is very tied in with punishment. So who's responsible gets punished. So what we find with big companies like this is, if it gets spread out so much, what ends up happening is exactly what Jorge was talking about at the beginning of class. It ends up just being a fine. Because if the CEO didn't know about it, and none of the programmers intended it, and the quality control just didn't catch an honest mistake, all we do to this company is we fine them. And if the worst thing that's going to happen to you as a company, if these sorts of mistakes are made, is a fine, you're going to begin to start pushing boundaries. So you're going to begin to start doing things that are genuinely worrisome, because you cease worrying about punishment, because it's unclear what the worst possible punishment is going to be. So for instance, how many people know what happened I guess it's like close to 5 years ago now, what happened with Volkswagen and their green emissions thing? Did people follow this? Do people remember this?
Yeah, a little bit. I think they
No, never heard of it.
devised like a cheat kind of strategy to pass those tests, like the polluting tests. And
yeah. So basically, here's what happened at Volkswagen as the company. Volkswagen, the German car company that makes like the VW Bug and the Jetta and all those other cars, what they did is they wanted to try to sell more cars, and they knew that people liked more greener vehicles that were better for the environment. So what they did is they devised a way to try to get their cars on the emissions tests to show that they were releasing very low levels of carbon. Now, the honest way of doing this would be what? If you want to convince your consumers that you have a car that has very low greenhouse gases, what's the honest way of doing this?
Spend a lot of money into research and build an actual car that...
The right way to do this is you build an actual green car. So here's what you would actually do. Here's a car and it's green. That would be the way to do it. But to build a properly green car costs a lot of money. And once you build the car, it will not perform as well in terms of speed, power, and other sorts of things as a car which is not built in this way. So VW looked at this and they thought, well, we can come up with a better idea. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to build a regular old car with old style emissions. But what we're going to do is we're going to program this car to recognize when an emissions test is happening. So something about the way it was set up, like in the testing site, when the car was in there, it was programmed to go, oh shit, I'm being tested. Oh, I shouldn't operate at full power. I should operate at green power. So it started just emitting the same emissions as the green car would have, but it recognized it was in a testing site. Now, the moment it went back out on the road, it started spitting higher levels of emissions again and running much better. So this car was getting great ratings because people were like, Volkswagen's done it. They found a car that runs perfectly, excellently, despite the fact that it's got low greenhouse gas emissions. But what was actually happening is it was just an ungreen car that was disguised to look like a green car whenever it was getting tested for emissions. So why did the company feel safe doing this? Well, what ended up happening to Volkswagen? Well, here's what happened. There was a big old fine, and the CEO was fired. He got a very cushy severance package of multiple millions of dollars. He is now happily retired. And Volkswagen, how many of you have seen a VW on the roads lately? I mean, if you're looking for them, you will see them. They are around. Like I saw one this morning. They did not get taken off the roads. You probably saw some Volkswagen commercials on the Super Bowl. I'm pretty sure the year after this happened, they started like a strong advertising campaign of like, we made mistakes in the past. And now VW's back to where they were before. Like they took a hit for a little bit, but the company's doing fine. So there was part of the reason that this was such a thing is no one knew who to hold responsible. They fired the CEO, but it wasn't like a personal decision of his. He probably had a case in which he said something like, improve profits. Somebody in the engineering department was, I have an idea. Somebody else took it and said, we can run with that idea. Programmers do this thing. The programmers were probably like, I'm not so sure about this, but you know what? I have a kid's college to pay for, so I'm going to do what they tell me to do. And so you can start to see how once it trickled down, it became very difficult to see who should be punished for it. And therefore, nobody really got that punished for it. Jorge, you had
no, it was just an opinion that the public, we the public have like short like memory. They know this, companies know this, so they invest a lot into public relationships and they apologize and we forget about it and keep consuming their product.
And that's spot on. Is one thing, we have a short memory. And secondly, another thing is just like we are programmed to, so actually I want to bring in these other two terms now. Liability is a legal notion. To hold someone legally responsible is to hold them liable. So if you, like in this case, Volkswagen was held legally liable for it. And they were held liable in terms of the amount of money they were fined. If you're also being held legally liable if you're sent to jail or something like that. To hold someone accountable is kind of a more broad category than responsibility, where you say that whoever caused this to happen, we're not going to blame them. However, we're still going to demand recompense and maybe punish them anyway. So the idea is that now, these days, our notion of responsibility is breaking down. And therefore, what's happening is this notion of accountability, where we think we should punish someone or even hold them legally liable, even if they're not to blame, it seems like what ends up happening is, if we don't have this one, people don't get that worked up about accountability and liability. Like if we hold a company liable, like nobody gets really mad about like, yeah, fine them. Like you don't have people, there's a reason at Trump rallies, people weren't chanting like, fine Hillary money, fine Hillary money. It was lock her up, lock her up. And why? Well, because this notion of holding someone legally liable is not a very emotionally strong notion. Instead, we want to hold people responsible. That's the satisfaction we're looking for. But as Jorge said, we only really hold people responsible when it's at the front of our mind and we're emotionally strongly attached to an issue. So this is the sort of case where there's a thing in which, like, if you hear that 75 people died in an accident, you get less worked up than the description of one person dying. Even if it's the case that like 75 people died horribly. Like if I tell you like there was a drone strike and 75 people were killed, you're just gonna be like, oh yeah, that's a thing. Who caused it? Well, you're not gonna get us up in arms. But if I describe to you like the legs blowing off one person, or I show you one picture of something, it gets people really worked up and we're more inclined to hold someone responsible. So what we see with these companies and what part of the issue is the defenses we have against extreme risk taking are kind of calibrated to worry about who's responsible for something. But more often what happens these days is it seems like companies need to be held legally liable or accountable where people get punished even if they didn't directly cause an action. And the worry is like the only way to lead to prevent risk taking, like if the CEO of a company was sent to jail for the behaviors of their company, for the behaviors of their employees, even if they didn't know it was happening, that CEO would be much more inclined to take much more careful oversight over the employees. However, we might, on the flip side, think it's not fair to send someone to jail if they didn't intend something to happen. It wouldn't be fair to send someone to jail just because they let something happen on their watch. They can't be everywhere. So what we see is if we're trying to punish people for things they're accountable for, i.e. things they didn't intend but bad things happen anyway, it seems too strong. If it seems like we can only punish people in terms of jailing or things like that when they're responsible, what ends up happening is we end up with these extreme risk-taking behaviors because very few cases in modern business lead to a sense that somebody is responsible for an action. So what we end up often doing is people just fall back on this notion of legal liability, and this is the only punishment we end up with. And then what ends up happening is there continues to be extreme risk-taking amongst companies. And so like these end up being major, major worries. All right, does everyone understand just what the no hands problem is, why it's an issue in computer science and computer businesses and for IT professionals?
Yep, Professor.
Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is, given these circumstances and given the difficulty of holding people responsible and liable, and given that codes of conduct are good but not perfect, and given that sometimes the only way to make something public or only way to get some information out there is to go public with it, what recompense does a person have? If you're an employee working at Volkswagen and you see, or back when they were doing these things, you see that they are doing this shady stuff with the cars, what do you have the power to do as an employee?
Whistleblow.
Yeah, whistleblow. And this is a very hot button topic, and it's not an easy one. So first off, what is whistleblowing? What is the definition of whistleblowing?
There's a lot of different definitions for whistleblowing, because basically some people in the text were like, oh, whistleblowing is basically when you release confidential information, but you also have like all these other parameters where you need to satisfy in order for it to be actually whistleblowing. Otherwise, there's like a difference between whistleblowing and leaking.
Yeah, so I think so what Marcus is pointing to is it's tough to differentiate good whistleblowing from bad leaking. But generally speaking, there is, and so what you were talking about there is in the book, they try to talk about the differences between these two, because in practice, you want to do this one in certain circumstances and you don't want to do this one, but there's not always a clear line between them. But strictly speaking, just to whistleblow, or like in both of these cases, how can we define both of these things, or what sort of action would fall under the umbrella of both of these?
Releasing confidential information.
Yeah, it's releasing confidential information specifically to the press and or somebody else outside the company. So for instance, if you were working for VW when they were doing this shady stuff and you went to your boss and said, boss, we're doing this shady stuff, that is not whistleblowing. It's only whistleblowing when you go outside the organization. So if you go to the New York Times and say, hey, we're doing some shady stuff at my company, here's all the information you need to publish a news story on it. That is whistleblowing or leaking. If you stay within the organization itself, it's not leaking / whistleblowing. Now, why is this such an ethical issue? Well, it's such an ethical issue for exactly the reason Marcus said. It's not clear where to draw the line between leaking information that shouldn't be brought to the public and whistleblowing out information, like genuinely bad things that a company is doing for the well-being of the public. So usually whistleblowing is cases in which the information that goes public is stuff that makes the company look bad, and the company is not doing anything about. And by bringing this information forward, you are going to be helping people out. So that's like a classic case of whistleblowing. The problem is, anytime you whistleblow, somebody's going to get mad and somebody's going to get harmed. And that's why why there's such a blurry line here, because how much harm moves whistleblowing into leaking and how much benefit moves leaking into whistleblowing. So does anyone have any cases that they want to discuss from these sorts of things? You can go with any of the ones from the textbook or ones you've heard of. I just need a sip of water for a second.
Snowden.
Yeah, so Snowden is the classic case. Who wants to describe the Snowden case so I can drink something?
So basically, Snowden was working for somebody, or was working with a company that was contracted with the government. He leaked NSA documents, and then in the end, he had to beg Russia to give him protection because the United States was going after him with a bunch of threats, and then also legal action because like they can kind of leak the. It was the difference between whistleblowing and leaking, but like people consider him a hero because he like released a bunch of stuff about the U.S. Spying and like taking data on the people. But then in the end, he went to Russia. I think he saved there. But then I think a few years ago, whatever, or recently, like that, he agreed to a $5 million payment or whatever to the United States, right, to pardon him or whatever. But like at the same time, if you can't afford that much money, you're kind of screwed.
Yeah.
And especially if you can't find refuge in another country.
And yeah, so the information, he was a subcontractor working for the NSA, the National Security Association. And basically while working there, he discovered that the US government had a lot of practices in place that were collecting data on the citizens without their knowledge. He deemed this information very harmful to the average US citizen because the average US citizen was, having information about them collected by the government. So he went public with this information. Now, the Snowden defenders say this was a classic case of whistleblowing. This was somebody who, for the benefit of most people, put his own career and life on the line in order to benefit everyone. The Snowden dislikers say this is somebody who put the well-being of Americans at risk. Because the fact is, a lot of the information that was a lot of these technologies were being used to track criminal organizations, used to track terrorist organizations, and also he, as a professional, has working for the U.S. government, has a responsibility to not leak information produced and created by the U.S. government, because that is built into his contract as somebody working for the government. You are a member of the nation. Therefore, even if you disagree with certain things, we have elected officials. The elected officials put in place these organizations who did these things. You do not now get to put national security at risk because you dislike the thing. So that's what one side said, and that's what the other side said. And the fact of the matter is, there's not a clear answer here. Like, you can, at the time, it split just about 50-50 of who thought Snowden was a hero and who thought he was a traitor of the nation. And so these are the sorts of worries that come up with whistleblowing. And the fact of the matter is, with whistleblowing, there's never a clear answer. And so, practically speaking, when should you whistleblow? I could just poll everybody and ask, when would you whistleblow? But the fact of the matter is, it's something to be thought about because there isn't a clear answer, and you need to take everything into account. So when deciding whether to blow the whistle on your company, what are all the things you need to take into account? What sorts of things should you have go through your head?
My life and financial security.
You, like, straight up, unless you are an actual martyr or somebody with the heart the size of a small country, you have to think about your own well-being and the well-being of your family. Like, that cannot be ignored. And part of the reason that Snowden was able to do this is he was a young person who didn't have a full family, and that's part of the reason he was willing to whistleblow. So that is something you literally have to take into account in a lot of these cases. What else should you take into account? So I said that whistleblowing is going behind the back or outside the company. What other things can you consider?
How much you'll do good or harm? Oh, my bad, Jorge.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead. It's okay.
Basically, how much good or bad it can deal to the public.
Bad to public. And then Jorge, what were you gonna say?
No, and before you go like outside the company, you could go and follow the company policies for, like disclosing information to them first.
Yeah.
The higher.
That's a really good one. So I'm going to go with Marcus's and then Jorge. So the first thing is, you have to consider how much benefit is what I'm doing going to do. If it's just the sort of thing where, like, you don't like your boss and it's going to hurt the bottom line and therefore everyone at the company is going to suffer, and the only good thing is that your boss looks stupid, you're going to have to ask yourself, is this really worth it? If there are lives on the line, though, and you could actively prevent deaths, that's another issue. And another thing to ask yourself is, are there systems in place within this company? And generally with this one, you want to exhaust all your possibilities inside the company before you go outside, for exactly these reasons of, if you go outside the company, it's going to not only cause possible harm to you, it also could cause harm to your company. So if you have any loyalty to the company, which, not saying you need to have that, but or to the fellow workers at that company, you have to consider, is there any way I can do this inside the company without actually harming anyone at the company? So always with whistleblowing, ask yourself, what are the positions in place? Would my boss listen to me? Is this the sort of thing where if I talk to my boss, it could put me in danger? So one of Snowden's main arguments for whistleblowing, instead of talking to the NSA, was that he believed that if he talked to the NSA, he would be physically in danger because they'd be monitoring him and worried about him, and therefore he would not be able to release this information to the public. So whenever whistleblowing questions come up, there is not a clear answer. All you can really do is ask yourself, are these sorts of things that I need to consider? And also, these sorts of issues also tie in with the question of, if you decide to whistleblow, how are you going to go about whistleblowing? And how you should go about whistleblowing is also tied in with these considerations. So, like, in Snowden's case, he stuck his name on it. And he stuck his name on it to give it more, like, value. If you say, hi, I'm Edward Snowden, I'm willing to put my life on the line and my name attached to this, that's one thing. But it's also possible to whistleblow anonymously. And the question becomes, like, in this particular case, like, I think in the Snowden case, like, if he had come forth anonymously, it wouldn't have had the same level of oomph. But there are plenty of other cases in which whistleblowers have come forward anonymously and it's gotten the job done. Jorge, did you want to say something?
Oh no, I know cases where they try to come out anonymously, but I don't know if it's the company that he outs has like released the name, in order to hurt him.
And so that's another thing to keep in mind. And that goes back to the personal well-being is the company that you are working against is very likely not going to just be like, yeah, you're right, we fucked up. They're going to, there's not nearly the credibility if you're anonymous. It could be made up, whatever. But on the flip side, if you don't come forward anonymously, what ends up happening is there can be like revenge from the company. So you have to ask yourself, like, do I want to come forward anonymously? If so, will I be credible? But if I do come forward with my name attached, does that mean I'm going to physically be at risk? So let's finish with one of my favorite cases of whistleblowing, just to show that anonymous whistleblowing does sometimes work and is sometimes valuable. So let's talk about Siri, Alexa, Google Assistant. So this was a couple years ago now. So how do these things work? Well, how do they work? What are they designed to do?
Voice activation and voice recordings.
Yeah, voice activation, voice recording. So basically what it works is you say, okay, Google, or hey, Siri, or Alexa. It then turns on, you say something, it gives you information back. So everyone, when you get this document, or when you get one of these, there's a little user agreement that you have to sign. In amongst that user agreement, there was the following clause. I agree that my that recordings of my requests can be analyzed for quality control purposes. So I agree that recordings of my requests can be analyzed for quality control purposes. So to use one of these things, you had to, this was a few years ago, you had to sign a user agreement and check off that box. So when you read this, does it sound especially alarming to you? What does it sound like they're going to be doing?
They're basically saving recordings and then they're going to analyze it later.
But does it sound like they're doing anything especially like upsetting?
Depends on the person. I would say really not.
Yeah, it doesn't sound that upsetting. However, what happened was after a while, it turned out what was going on is by this, what they actually meant was they hired a third-party company with basically these people sat there listening live into Alexa requests or Siri requests to see whether or not the answer that Siri was giving was responding to the question that they themselves heard. So rather than just recordings being recorded, what was happening is there were rooms full of people listening in live on Siri and Alexa recordings. Now, this isn't generally an issue because Siri and Alexa are, most of the time when you ask Siri, like, hey, Siri, what's the weather? She turns on because you asked her, hey, Siri, what's the weather? But how many of you have ever worked with these things? How many of you have spent time around one of these digital assistants?
Nope.
All the time.
Yeah. Does it always turn on only when you expect it to and only when you want it to?
No, my friends have them and they just turn on randomly
Yeah,
sometimes.
every once in a while. If you're like talking, every once in a while, if you're like, somebody was it someone in this class where I was saying, like, talking about Google and their Google Assistant turned on? So sometimes it turns on even if you don't want it to. Also, Siri turns on by accident. And what they ended up discovering was that what started happening is people in these rooms discovered they were getting listening in live to a lot of things that people on the other end would not be happy about them listening in live to. So someone discovered, let's just focus on these cases. Somebody discovered that the sound Siri is not that different from the sound made when a zipper unzips. Now, can anyone imagine a case in which there might be a zipper unzipping that you wouldn't want a stranger listening in live in the next several minutes? So yes, what they discovered is large numbers of these people ended up listening in live to intimate moments between multiple individuals. Now, the person had no idea they were being listened to live during these moments. Also, what they discovered is Siri often accidentally got turned on when somebody accidentally pressed the button on the side of an Apple Watch. In the same way, can anyone imagine a possibly intimate circumstance in which a button on the side of your watch might gently be pressed without your realizing it? So people at these companies were like, oh, wait, we from the inside are all of a sudden listening in on large numbers of sexual encounters between people who have no idea that we're listening to this live. And so people started releasing this. There were also cases in which Siri accidentally got turned on during a drug deal once. There were lots of cases like this in which people were, these companies, under the guise of quality control, had people listening in live. Yeah, are you serious? Are you serious? Siri thinks you're talking to it. Also, anytime like an Alexa commercial just inevitably turns on Alexa. Like all of these are worries. And what ended up happening is there was nobody was coming along and saying this is screwed up. It took someone on the inside to go, you know what? The public should have a vote on whether or not Siri should listen to them having sex. Like people need to know this is what is happening to them. And we need to talk about this as a country and as a company. And so what they did is they anonymously leaked this to companies or to newspapers who followed up, and these things have since been changed. So just to be clear, sometimes whistleblowing, even anonymously, can have good consequences. So just be aware. But again, you have to take into account these sorts of situations. All right. We've made it to 1:17, so I'm 2 minutes over. I apologize for your 2 minutes. I can't give them back to you, but I can wish you all a very, very happy weekend. And I will see you all next week for security. I think next week's security. All right. If no one has any more questions, I'm going to shut off the recording, shut off everything else, and I will see you all next week. Have a good one.